I want to welcome everybody to the Ashford Teaching and Learning Conference. My name is Jill Johnson. I will be your host for this session. I'm excited to introduce Providing Feedback Students Want and Use, presented by Stephanie Heald-Fisher and Gail Hoskyns-Long, faculty members in the Ford School of Business here at Ashford University. The chat window will be open during the session for your questions and comments, as well as a short Q&A at the close of the session. And here are Gail and Stephanie.
Thank you for the introduction, Jill. I'm Stephanie Heald-Fisher. I'm an adjunct for the Department of General Education. I guess it's associate professor, sorry. I've taught in the online environment for over 12 years. And prior to that, my background was in banking, hospitality, and retail. Gail?
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Gail Hoskyns-Long, and I teach full-time at the Ford School of Business. And I have taught both face-to-face and online for the past 10 years. And I come from the automotive design and manufacturing background.
So Gail and I met as online students while working on our PhDs at Capella. And we have been on both sides of this equation, not receiving usable feedback as students and feeling like our students are not using the feedback we're providing. So that led us to our interest in the topic and why we actually conducted research on it. So feedback on assignments is a common tool used by instructors to communicate with students. We conducted a study on the topic, and as a result of our research, we developed 7 best practices to help improve student learning. And that's what we would like to share with you today. Briefly, we had this as our research goal, and we started by first reviewing the research on student expectations for feedback. We found lots of research on that topic. Then we looked at the kind of feedback online instructors are providing and how it matched up to the student expectations identified in the research. That time we found no research. So there wasn't anything really looking at it from the instructor's perspective, and in particular from the online instructor's perspective. So we developed a qualitative study, and we asked instructors for samples of their feedback and then analyzed the results by comparing it to that previous research on student expectations. Before we get into the 7 best practices, though, we'd like you to take a moment and think about how you give feedback. If you could, kind of jot down somewhere the types of, no, not yet with the poll. The poll is at the end. Hello? AJ, whomever's running the poll, if that could be put at the end, that would be great. Right now, what we'd like you to think about is, when you give feedback, what modes are you using for providing feedback? Are you using email or rubrics, or, those are kinds of modes? What do you say in your feedback? Think about things like what you focus on when assessing your students' work. We're going to be revisiting this topic at the end of the presentation. That's why we kind of wanted you to jot down some notes while you're thinking about how you provide feedback. And then at the end, we'll compare it to the 7 best practices that we came up with. So a little bit of background. What is feedback? Well, it's a tool that's used by instructors to communicate to their students, and a tool that's used by students to hopefully improve their learning behaviors. Unfortunately, we found that delivering usable feedback continues to be an area of disconnect between students and instructors. So it's not always clear to us as instructors if and when students are actually using the feedback we worked so hard to give them. Current research indicates that students do not significantly incorporate feedback given to them by their instructors. And they also do not incorporate it in subsequent work because they're often not reviewing the feedback. Any of this sound familiar to those of you in the audience? I'd be willing to bet it does. While feedback can be used along with assessments, we want to make sure that we're not confusing it as being the same thing. Okay, assessments evaluate knowledge without any qualitative comments, whereas feedback is a tool for improved learning and or changing behaviors by using qualitative comments. Some of the assessments we're used to seeing are pass or fail quizzes, right or wrong answers, scores, grades. We focused on the qualitative narrative comments that were provided. So those types of assessments that I was just explaining were not a part of our study. So we look strictly at when we have to give narrative feedback to students. Now, when I asked you to reflect on your process for providing feedback, I mentioned thinking about the modes of feedback. And in reviewing the feedback process, we found there were a number of things that faculty need to consider. One of the most important considerations is whether or not students can access the feedback. So that was the first of these considerations. And this primarily refers to the mode the instructor is using as far as accessing it. These are the 6 modes that we found through our research that instructors were using. So as you know, the top row are pretty much requirements for us as instructors at Ashford to use. The email piece was a little bit surprising. We're not used to returning like feedback to students in emails, but again, it was a study across the board with other instructors who work in an online environment. So in order to motivate our students to use the feedback we're giving them, it's also important to understand those expectations. And if we're putting it in a mode they cannot or do not want to access, we get back to that exercise in futility where we feel like they are not using the feedback we're providing. The second consideration were feedback requirements. So these are 7 feedback requirements that came up in our study. And these are institutional requirements. So as we know, Ashford asked us to follow certain requirements when giving feedback. So that was the second component that we looked at in our study. These requirements also play an important role in how we develop our feedback because we need to meet the expectations of the students, but also the expectations of our school. And then finally, the third thing that we looked at were feedback types. And these are 7 types of feedback comments that previous research said students were looking for. This was in addition to returning the feedback quickly to them. And in our study, we felt that this was probably the most critical part of giving feedback to students. Content being comments on the actual concepts and content in the work. Skills could be things like APA skills and writing skills and formatting skills. Students look for guidance, like where they did well or where they kind of went off track. They look for comments that tell them how they can improve their future work. We also found that students look for encouraging and motivational types of comments in their feedback, and they appreciate being directed to resources that would help them make the improvements we're saying they need to make. So that was kind of the background on our research. These are the best practices that we came up with. So I'm going to turn it over to Gail, and she's going to look at each more in detail.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Let's get started with the first best practice of embedding feedback throughout the paper. Many of us think reading a paper and then writing a summary at the end is good practice, but our literature review told us that embedding comments throughout a paper was much better than a summary at the end of the paper. Here you can see an example of some embedded comments using waypoints. There are a few different options for adding comments. You can type custom comments, you can use the pre-made comments already in waypoint, or you can make your own pre-made comments. You can also use other popular tools to embed comments, such as the track and insert comments options in Word, and then attach your marked up document to waypoint. And you can find a link at the bottom of the summarized feedback area in waypoint for attaching documents. The second best practice is to personalize the feedback. When we say personalize the feedback, there's more to it than just using the student's name. You want to be unique. You want to show the student that you have really read their paper. And this is a good way to connect with the student. You don't want to use the same generic statement to everyone in the class. Trust me on this. Students compare notes. Stephanie and I used to compare notes all the time. And here you can see an example of personalization. You can see that the instructor used the student's name and then went on to mention something specific about the student's paper by mentioning Southwest Airlines, because that was the company the student used for their example. And this way you're assuring the student that you really read their paper. The third best practice is to provide areas for improvement. To be useful, not only does the feedback need to measure how the student did on the assignment, it needs to provide a way to the student to be able to improve upon their work. You don't want to give back a paper with just a letter grade. This is an opportunity for you to tell the students how to bring their B grade paper to an A grade or from a C grade to an A grade. Another thing is that constructive criticism needs to be actionable. You can see in this example where the instructor tells the student to use bullet points instead of long sentences when making slides for presentations. This way the student knows what action they need to take to improve. Building from the last best practice of actionable improvements, the constructive criticism also needs to be specific. Vague comments such as good job or needs improvement are not usable to the student. The student won't know what to do with the information. And you can see here another example of how the instructor added specific. Start with the positives. When embedding comments and when writing the summary, you want to start with the positive so you don't discourage the students. The students will be much more receptive to the feedback if it is positive. And this can be challenging, especially if you see that they did something wrong right from the start, such as spelling your name wrong on the title page. In this case, you might want to start with the positive with something like nice format, and then add the correct spelling of my name is such and such. Or when you're writing the summary, you can start off with something like, good start, you had the right idea, and then say something specific and actionable as the improvement. And you can see from this example how these best practices all start working together. The sixth best practice is timeliness. We thought it was interesting that the literature review said that a relatively short turnaround time was needed. And this is a good example of why specifics are needed. We weren't really sure what relatively short turnaround meant. The good news is that at Ashford, timeliness is specifically spelled out for us. We need to grade the discussions within 3 days and the written assignments within a 5-day period. The last best practice is to be mindful of length. Even if all the best practices are followed, if there's too much feedback, especially if the feedback is negative, the student will only absorb a portion, if any, of your feedback at all. So you don't want to overwhelm the student. So pick out the most important items, apply the 7 best practices, and be succinct. Well, that wraps up our 7 best practices, and so I will now turn it back to you, Stephanie.
Okay, so these are our 7 best practices that we came up with. And hopefully everybody's had a chance to make note of those, because we'd like to go back and review the feedback. And now we have polls for you. In the first poll, what we'd like you to do is think about the notes you made when I asked you to think about what it is you do to give feedback. So in reviewing how you presently provide that feedback, which of the 7 best practices are you currently using? And you can mark more than one. So if you're using more than one, which would be great, you can mark more than one. So and this was interesting for us as well, because when we presented this research elsewhere, we found that not everybody was using all of them. And in fact, there were people who weren't even using any of them, and that might explain some of their frustration. Okay. It looks like the answers are winding down, so we can probably end the poll then. Okay, so as we look at the best practices, it looks like the winner is providing areas for improvement, so that's great. And personalizing feedback and adding specifics are also good, but there's obviously areas that we could improve on, you know, embedding feedback in the paper or in waypoints, starting with the positives as well. We have a second best practice, or second poll about our best practices. And again, the question is, which of the 7 best practices do you feel that you can begin using today to improve the feedback you're providing students? So these are our 7 best practices. And one of the things we tried to keep in mind when we developed these best practices was to make them something easy for us as instructors to do. Gail and I have both gone to a lot of seminars on online conferences, and you'll see people who give you really great, you know, video resources, and you can edit videos and do magic here, but there's such a big learning curve that we're pretty busy people, and a lot of times we don't have a chance to use it. So our goal with these best practices is that you find something that you can easily use. And if you feel, you know, you should be able to go back and, you know, not need to learn anything about these best practices, just start developing them as a habit. So, okay, it looks like the participation is kind of winding down on that, so we can probably show everybody the results. And it looks like the number one thing is to be mindful of length. And to be honest, that's something that I was terribly guilty of. I wanted to just let them know everything that they needed to improve. And what I learned from the research is that then becomes overwhelming to the students, and then they shut down and they don't use any of it. So now I try to pick like 2 things that they need to improve and leave it at that. It also looks like starting with the positive and embedding feedback were 2 other good practices. A lot of people were going to be trying. That's another one that I really have to consciously work at. Because, again, I want to start off by saying, okay, this needs fixing, that needs fixing, the other thing needs fixing. But, and as we were putting this together, Gail even mentioned, start with the positives even in your embedded comments. So try not to have the very first thing you say in embedded comments be something negative. So, okay, so that pretty much wraps up everything we had to present. Gail, Alan mentioned about math students not having to write papers. I know you do a lot of quantitative instruction. Can you share how you might be able to use that for quantitative instructors?
Well, a lot of times you can put it in, even though it's a quantitative answer, you can explain it in a qualitative way. If you can put it in a story or a situation using the numbers, sometimes that helps. Does that answer your question?
Well, you think,
hello?
Hopefully.
Do you hear
I'm
me?
here. Yes, we can hear you. Alan is responding. So,
okay, I don't see anybody on the chat.
Oh, okay. He said yes. That helps him understand how he can use these best practices. I'm also sharing the references because Dr. Arena asked to see what our references were. Are there any other questions? Are there any best practices that you use that we didn't have that you'd want to share with us? Something we could learn from. Feel free to share those too. Otherwise, well.
Ladies, thank you. It's still, we're kind of at the end of our session with you, and I just want to, let everybody go ahead and throw in any more questions or practices they use. But I do want to thank you, Gail and Stephanie, for your presentation, as well as all of you attending the session. Just a quick review, if you have time. There's a brief end of session survey at the bottom of the Adobe Connect room. If you guys have a quick second, go ahead and give some feedback. But the overall presentation will be available for viewing in the CETL, and we will send an email when the live sessions are